fancier equipment than I do. So
Yeah, no, so I learned how to do this a while ago. Basically, this links to my YouTube account. It's like called a live event in YouTube, but it actually records it through Google Hangouts on air. So it's actually like
nice.
great.
Uh, that's awesome. How are you?
I'm good. I've been, I think I told you throughout the program, I feel like I've been like playing catch up because I came into the program a little later, but I
Uh,
really like this project I kind of landed on, and I've been enjoying it so far.
Good. Yes, I'm just I'm happy to see you. Glad you're doing well.
Yeah. How are things going on your end, actually?
Good. Just lots of work, but it's all good things. So I'm excited about all that is going on. I haven't had as much travel recently. Um, Only a few days next week, but been pretty much BC based for a little more than a month, which has been nice.
Mm, that's good. Well, so this is gonna be fun diving into identities. I'll give a little bit more background. I think I did in the email, but for my capstone, I'm thinking about restarting my blog that I worked on before Kresge. And so the overarching theme is radical empathy. And I am approaching it in a variety of ways and writing about it from different facets. But I wanted to start with what I know best, and what I know best is mixed people. And so I feel like mixed people have a very unique experience and perspective in life, and that they are in an in group and an out group at the same time, and they know how to dive into different people's perspectives almost because they're forced to in a way. I don't think this is limited only to mixed people. I think a lot of people of color deal with this. I think second generation immigrants deal with this tension a lot. I think of our friends in the trans and gender fluid and LGBTQ community. So I do not think this is limited to mixed people, but I just kind of wanted to start there since it's kind of a topic I know better. So
I totally understand.
yeah, so yeah, it's like a big kind of like initial background. But so I thought we could dive right in. So what I usually start with is I read this paragraph from a piece that actually inspired me to start the blog in the first place. It's from this professor. His name is Alberto Gomez, and he actually works at the University of Helsinki, of all places. Um, and I'll read it to you, and I would love to get your initial reactions because I think it's a good jumping off point for the interview. So the paragraph reads, a couple of days ago, someone dropped by my office at the University of Helsinki to speak to me. She looked at my name on the door and then inquired, "Are you Mexican?" I replied, "No, but your name is Alberto Gomez. It's a Mexican name, and you look Mexican." I responded, "Yes, it is, but it's also an Italian name, a Brazilian name, a Portuguese name, and even Sri Lankan." Puzzled, she asked, "So what are you?" Who am I? I pondered whether I should go through my metaphorical bag of identities and retrieve one of my many identities, perhaps an anthropologist. However, I know that this is yet again a question that is asked in a quest to pigeonhole the respondent, to locate the person one is inquiring about into an imaginary map, a collection of identities, typically cultural, national, or ethnic. Um, and so the reason I like to start out with this paragraph is because I really like that imagery of a metaphorical bag of identities and reaching in to pluck one out at different times. And so I just love some of your initial thoughts or reactions to that.
Yeah, I think it's a great place to start, because one, I think that especially many of us have been approached with those same questions, like, who are you? What are you? Where are
Mm-hmm.
you from? And literally just kind of having to think through those kinds of questions, and realizing that oftentimes as people of color, we're the ones that are approached with those kinds of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then there's the other side of it too, where it causes one to think more about identity and who we are and how we talk about ourselves and how we show up in different spaces and places. And you know, it's such an interesting discussion to have around identity, especially when you're mixed. Um, I think about my own experiences and the fact that I'm half Native and half white. Um, Even thinking about that,
Mm-hmm.
it's it's hard sometimes for people to understand unless you're mixed, um, or biracial, um, for people to kind of relate to that and understand. And I think even for those of us that are, um, the experiences that we have are all varied. And yeah, for me especially, I identify as being Native,
Mm-hmm.
mostly because culturally and just in my own family, that's what I was raised with, most especially just because of the generation that my parents come from. Um, so I was never able to really get to know the white side, mostly just because of the history and the context of my family and where my parents are from.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we've all gotten those questions of where are you really from or what are you? Um,
Yes.
um, and so, in an effort to let people self-identify and describe their own identities, I'm going to ask a few series of questions just to talk about that specifically. But so, where were you born originally?
I was actually born in Denver, Colorado, the Rocky Mountains.
Oh, nice.
Yes. My father was in the Air Force for 20 years. So Denver was one of the last places that where he was stationed while he was in the service. And I just myself and two of my younger brothers happened to be born in Denver.
Mm. And what nationality are you currently?
Um, yeah, indigenous to the U.S. So essentially Native American or Native.
Mhm. Um, what ethnicities or races would you identify yourself with?
I would identify with being American Indian. I have never claimed the white side,
Mhm.
um, just because it's uh, something I never knew.
Mm,
And even from, outside of my own family, being in society, I have never been viewed as a white person.
mm,
And
mhm.
at least people have my experiences, people have never seen me that way.
I think you basically answered the next one, but what culture do you identify with?
Uh, that would be native.
Yeah. And this is an interesting one I sometimes like to ask is, are these the same things? And if not, why? So, I asked about nationality, ethnicity, race, and culture. And I did that very specifically because actually, you have pretty aligned answers, but a lot of people don't for those questions.
Yes.
And so, I don't know if you have any thoughts. Are these the same things? Race, ethnicity, culture, or nationality?
For me, they're different. Just because I think that in some ways it's a census related kind of question.
Mm,
It's also like there's a legal framework to it. There's a policy framework to it. But that also like the cultural aspect, it's just how I identify myself, who I am and where I'm from.
mhm,
So even being a native person, um, being specifically from a tribe here in the US, I always identify first my tribal nation because
mm,
of the legal status of tribes here in this country of being sovereign nations. So I say that I'm a dual citizen.
mm,
I'm a citizen of my tribe, which is a sovereign nation, a nation in the U.S.
mhm,
Then I am a citizen of the I'm a U.S. citizen. So most people don't know that legal framework, or the structure of tribes as sovereign nations. So oftentimes, if I say I'm a dual citizen, it confuses people. Um,
mm. Ah,
unless you're native, yeah. But most people don't know about that particular construct and what it actually means, and the history behind it. So, but for me, those are all, you know, different aspects and have different definitions and different meanings for me.
Yeah, that is a very good point. The citizenship and like how we think about that, and in nations actually in general. Which tribal nation do you belong to?
It's Ho Chunk. It's
Sure.
HO dash chunk, CHUNK. So there's a little more than 7,000 of us that remain. So we're based in Wisconsin, and
Mm,
I still have many family members that live there, that very much so identify as being a part of the tribe. It's, I guess, it's always, on the one hand, knowing our history, the history of colonization,
yeah.
the genocide my own family has gone through, my ancestors. Um, Most people don't realize when we say that we come from small tribes. I mean, literally, there's like a little more than 7,000 of us that remain
Mm,
compared to the many thousands that existed before. So it's,
mm.
on the one hand, important for me to mention it, but it also is sad at the same time, because there are so few of us that remain.
Yeah. Well, I usually save this question for near the end, but I think it's with the same topic you're talking about, which is how has colonization affected the lives of your family or your life in particular?
I'd say it has completely impacted us in many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's um, it impacted the way that even being able to know my father's side of the family because of what white supremacy. There were many of my on my father's side were active members of the KKK. Um, Active, just it was very difficult for my father to marry my mother and then for them to have children together.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think I shared with you, my father was disowned by his own family.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, that all stems from the legacy of colonization and structural racism and the hatred that my own father's family had for Native people.
Yeah.
And then, on my mother's side, coming from a tribal nation, and for them to, my own relatives having gone through the Indian boarding school experience, my own grandfather being pulled away from his community, from his family,
Mm.
the impact on the loss of language and culture, um, and just how that impacted my own family from historical trauma. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Much of what my own family experienced was because of the larger scale impact of colonial policies that that were forced upon tribes, not only in just in the educational realm, but also just Indian child welfare issues,
Mm-hmm.
where my own family was displaced in the late 1800s, early 1900s, around because of the different land policies and the stealing of land by the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
So my family was displaced over the years, um, and it wasn't until like the mid 1900s where my family was able to return home to some of our original homelands in Wisconsin. So, there's been extensive trauma
Mm-hmm.
because of that. And, we still very much so feel the impacts today. Um, and then at the same time, we have, as a family, have held steadfast to our culture, to our tribal language and the ways of being. Um, we survived for a reason, right?
Yeah.
We joke and say we survived because we were stubborn. But there's a lot of truth to that. but colonization has played a huge role in my family and who we are today.
Mm. This is a related question, and I think it's a framework that's not usually applied to the Native identity, but I have it here because I think it is related to colonization. But do you consider yourself part of a diaspora?
I do. I think in many ways, just it relates to probably the nature of the work that I do, especially, and the people that I'm able to connect to, especially in community and community organizing, the mobilizing work. I think it's important to be able to be in that space. I look at it from an opportunity to be able to connect to people, humanizing, and opening up a space where people are able to support one another. That's just how I sort of envision that for myself and how I see myself in wider spaces.
Absolutely. No, I like the way you describe that, actually. So we dove into the deep end of the questions. We can come back to some of the but does religion tie into your identity? If so, how does it?
It does, in the sense that I describe myself as being a spiritual person versus a religious person. I don't have a church that I go to. I don't have like a regular, like, many people, especially here in Michigan, that's just a heavy focus on churches and Christianity or Catholicism, which I totally understand. But for me, being a Native person, my church is wherever I am, or because I have a regular spiritual practice, but I really just base that off of culturally and in my own tribal language of how I show up and how I relate to a creator that isn't tied to a specific religious belief or a church per se.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I think I might have shared with you that so I was raised Catholic, and I left the church when I was 14. I decided not to get confirmed. And I now identify as a spiritual atheist. I think that's the thing I can describe myself as. But yeah, no, I've spent a lot of time in spiritual practices, particularly meditation, but a couple different kinds of meditation. And I think I told you I spent a lot of time in India and Japan. Spent a lot of time in East Asia in general, but those two places have resonated the most with me spiritually. And it sounds strange, but whenever I'm back in the US, I always want to like bottle whatever I had there, like the sense of, I always say, like, when I was in India, I was able to feel like everything and everyone. And then in Japan, I was able to feel the opposite, which was just as valuable, feeling like nothing or no one. And both of them are very profound and useful feelings to have when you're meditating. But then here, it's really hard to tap into either of those energies. Yeah. Anyway, just as a side note.
Yeah. No, it is difficult because it's a different kind of practice, and it's especially here in this country. It's almost like you have to, like, if you don't go to church or if you don't have that sort of a background, and if it isn't something you necessarily practice in your own community where you live, it's almost like, for me, my home has become a refuge, and I've created that space where I'm able to practice my native spirituality. Even just thinking about like the diaspora in terms of where I'm from culturally, my own tribe. and reconnecting to that space, because it's such a, it's almost like there is no like Bible per se, or there is no Quran or anything along those lines that that's, you know, that's written, that, you know, a person follows. Everything is very oral, and it's done through language, and it's done through songs, and in different, in many ways, like sometimes it can be a form of its own meditation. But I have had to find those spaces wherever I am, to be able to practice that.
That's really interesting. That's very cool. So one of the kind of standard questions I like to ask, which I think is interesting, is what term do you tend to use to describe yourself? So do you say mixed, multiracial, multi-ethnic, or do you have another way that or other words that you use to describe yourself?
I say native. Even though I'm half white, I literally just say native, because I, you know, having gone through what I've, you know, have experienced, and my father's isolation away from his own family, I don't even say that I'm biracial. I literally just say that I'm native.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. I interviewed a few other people earlier today, and one of my colleagues identified purely as Black, even though he's biracial as well. For reasons.
It's so fascinating how this plays out.
Yeah. Are you still there?
Hi, there we are.
Great.
It's like Skype.
I'm glad I didn't stop the broadcast. I was like, no, I don't want to have to start a whole new thing.
We're still here.
So the next one, this one is, I think, also very interesting. It's, I think we all have a lot of reactions to this, but it's, how does it feel to be part of a culture that is not a majority in your country? But I think it's kind of double-fold for you, because as you described, one of the nations you belong to, you may be seen more as the majority, but in the United States, you know, the way it is operating right now, you'd be considered the minority. So it'd be just interesting, like, you know, do you consider yourself part of minority or majority, and how does that feel being a part of that in the country or nations you belong to?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, because if, like, even in my own tribal nation, we are the majority. Like, we may be dispersed throughout different locations, but really, you know, the area that we're at, we are the majority of the people. And that, in essence, you know, the values, the principles, all those things are so deeply ingrained and deeply embedded that when I'm there, I have to change up the way that I function or the way that I show up. But then coming outside of that and into the wider US society, you do feel, and so many Native people feel this way because there's so few of us, that, you know, most people don't even know that we still exist. So we deal with the issues around invisibility, and people even recognizing that we are still here and alive and well. And, you know, even if there's so many places that I've noticed, even in the state of Michigan, if I look at different images in different places, or even here in the Midwest, if I go through airports, you always see Native folks, when they do these historical timelines, we are always at the very beginning of the timeline. And we're always viewed as just these historical images. And then for some reason, after like 1492, we just disappear. and we're no longer there, and we're never seen as contemporary people. So that's a real challenge sometimes, because it's most people don't even know that we're just not on people's radar. We don't show up. We're not on TV. We know, people don't see us on television. They don't see us in the mainstream films. There's so many different issues. So it's so interesting to go from home, and then once I step out of that space, life very much so changes.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Do you feel like, have you felt that, given the lack of awareness and some of the invisibility, do people treat you differently, knowing that you're Native American or that's your identity?
It depends on where I'm at. It's here in the Midwest. The experiences vary. Where on the one hand, it's very there is very much so racist treatment, the isolation, sometimes the bigotry and the hatred that exists. And then there's the flip side of, sometimes the people that can be very, very respectful, very understanding, and they have some sort of awareness. And then there's just the romanticizing or the exoticizing of Native people, more especially Native women, where it can become deeply problematic of how we are treated in various places. Even if I go out into the plains or out on the West Coast, it's in some places where it's much more conservative. Obviously, the racism increases and the isolation. But even in some of the liberal spaces, it's it's just that underneath that, people that try to say that they're understanding and they have some knowledge, that racism still exists.
Yeah. One of the questions I have on here is, how does your racial identity interplay with your gender? But it sounds like you already started talking about that.
It's alive and well.
Yeah. I think exoticism's a big piece of that. I think, I'm thinking about my mother, who is, I think I've told you, she's from the Seychelles, and she's African, Indian, and French, but looks very much mixed with African and Indian. And I do think there is exoticism that plays out when she's out in public spaces,
Yes.
Yeah, very much so. Especially when she was younger. Yeah.
There's something that happens. Yeah. I think I told you this. I was in shopping on a Pier 1 one evening here in Battle Creek, and there was an employee at the shop that literally just came up to me and grabbed my hair.
Oh yeah.
And she was saying, "Oh, you're so exotic, and where are you from?" And so I had to have the discussion around personal boundaries. And
yeah.
Do you normally do that with every single person that walks into the shop?
Yeah, no, that's really bad. That's like, it is objectification, because it's like, it's, treating someone like an object, literally.
Exactly. Like you're just your hair.
Right.
Not a full-fledged human being walking around,
I haven't, so I don't use every question I have on my list because I have so many. This one I haven't asked people too much, but I think it might be an interesting one to talk about. Is there a time you felt proud to be part of your culture, and has there been a time you felt ashamed to be part of your culture? Any way you define culture.
What is that? Are you getting any static on your line?
No. Are you getting some?
I am on my side.
It's pretty quiet.
Could just be from our side because the Wi-Fi hasn't always been so great this week.
Oh no.
I'm like, I hope this works. Let's see. Yeah, there's so much static.
Oh.
Let me see.
Well, let me know if it does continue. We can. I can switch. I can just call you on your cell, and then I'll just type.
Okay. Let's see. All right. It sounds like it's gotten a little bit better now. I don't know what. Probably just the connection.
Okay.
So the question around being proud of who I am, and there's definitely been moments along the way where I have been super proud of who I am, my background, and more specifically my family. I think it was a time when in high school where I was, because there were only a few Native students in the school that I was at. We were targeted as Native people, as Native students, because there were only 3 of us at the school. And so there were moments where I really did get, there was a lot of bullying, some racism that happened, and just a real specific targeting of Native students. We'd walk in the hallway and just be made fun of. Kids would say really horrible things. And we always tried to hold our head up high. But as a young person, we tend to internalize more of that rather than speak out. But one of the things that I learned from my mother during that time was, I let her know about what I was experiencing in school and what was happening. So she literally sat down with me and started to talk through how I needed to advocate for myself. And she reminded me about our family, who we are, the people that we come from, our culture. And she talked with me about the importance of being able to speak out for myself. And she worked with me and in the school as well. She and I did it together, where we connected with one of my teachers. We also connected with the principal and talked through the issues to a point where I was literally able to give a speech to the entire school about Native people, about who we are. So this was like in my senior year of high school, where I gave a very brief speech about Native history, my own tribe, and talked about where I was from, etc. And for my mom, it was about her teaching me to stand up for myself. And also just about finding a way to educate people and address some of that hatred and find the best and quite possibly the safest way of doing that.
Yeah.
So that was one time where, it just really stood out for me, and it has my whole life, about one of the clearest instances where I had a moment where I was like absolutely proud of my family and where I'm from and who I am.
Yeah. It's amazing. I mean, do you, part of why I started this is, like I said, to talk about, radical empathy and how do we build that between different groups of people. And, it seems like this was a really interesting and smart way to try to do that, to address people that clearly did not have any empathy.
Exactly. It's like a little bit problematic,
No, absolutely. Throughout your work or your life, like, have you found other useful tactics or interventions to build that kind of radical empathy between people?
I try to I try to find ways in which to humanize every single situation that I'm in,
Mm,
especially if there are real moments of tension. And I try to find ways in which to meet people halfway or
mm,
meet people where they are. Because I think the system in which we live, especially in this country, with structural racism and its impact, it's, people don't know what they don't know. And I
yeah.
think the educational system in this country does an extreme disservice to everyone,
Mm,
um, especially if we think about the hierarchy of human value and the impact of white supremacy and um, everything related to white privilege and how that shows up and manifests itself. I try to see the humanness in each person, which is not always so easy. Um, but I just think if I can find a way to connect to a person, um, then maybe we can start to see each other if we build those experiences together and build trust and build a strong relationship. Um, there are times, just because of how hatred works itself out, that is not always possible, to build empathy or to
yeah.
build those connections. I think about my father's own family. The fact that his parents, especially his mother, um, passed away, and because of her hatred, she could never acknowledge her grandchildren. Um, and his own relatives could never acknowledge this whole other part of, their relatives' family, just because of the fact that they were Native. Um, Even to this day, it's not the safest space to try and go visit, to even find a way to connect, because they're still so deeply immersed in that life. Um, and it's a very sad state of affairs. Um, but I do recognize that it is not always possible to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And I keep thinking of there are people that are just unfortunately lost to us, in some ways.
Mhm.
Um, and there are people that think could be open. And so it sounds strange, but the question that's been plaguing me for a long time is like, how do you scale empathy? Is there such a thing? Is that possible?
Yes. I I don't know. And it
Yeah.
almost just seems like each of us kind of thinks of empathy in different ways.
Yeah.
Um, and then how, whose version is the right version, or even if I talk about, humanizing a situation, my sense of humanizing will go through my lens, and it may not be the way in which you envision it or how you see it.
Hmm. It's true. Yeah. No, it's very true. I mean, as much as we do want to step outside of our own experience, and I think some people are more successful at that than others. Like in some ways, your lens will always like trump trump the other. Yeah, so,
That's true.
yeah. I have some questions on here related to philanthropy that I think would be interesting since
Mm.
you're definitely working in some of this work. But one thing I'm curious about is what should philanthropy be thinking about as the population diversifies and as more people become mixed, honestly?
I think philanthropy in general needs to be deeply immersed in racial equity.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, even if we think about the founding of philanthropy and how it functions and how it's been set up in this country, it's primarily been driven by, wealthy white families or wealthy white individuals. Um, and what's fascinating is that those that wealth and those riches came off the backs of people of color. And
Yeah.
so if we think about sort of the state of philanthropy today, it's still primarily driven um, by white people in positions of, from board members all the way through presidents and CEOs. So there's an extensive amount of work that needs to be done in terms of racial equity. I mean, the demographics and the population movements in this country are changing quite rapidly, and soon enough, people of color are going to make up a huge component of our of populations, of demographics in different places, um, and our faces and experiences and stories need to be reflected in philanthropy. Um, and I think that's still going to continue to take time. Um, Even with the Kellogg Foundation and our own president, CEO, um, who's like an amazing African American woman who, she's been in post for a few years now, who's doing really fantastic work. How many years it's taken for someone like her to be able to come into the position in which she's leading such a huge institution in this country. Um, it's amazing for her. At the same time, we can see how long it has taken for her to be able to come into post and do the work that she's doing now. Yeah, there's a lot that needs to be worked on.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. A very like similar and related question is how has your identity and what you know influenced your grant making?
I think one of the things that I am very mindful of is if I look at the investments, because I have a racial equity portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Obviously, I'm deeply immersed in that, so I'm ensuring that resources and grants are getting out to communities of color, more community-based organizations that are led by leaders of color, etc. So my own identity is ensuring that there are there are equitable disbursements going out across communities, um, and also just in the nature of my relationships with partners. um, I don't even say grantees, I
Mm.
say partners, because that's how I envision the work, that's how I see people, that's how I see organizations. um, and for me, it's about the relationships that I have with people, and I'm always trying to humanize things, um, come at it from a place of service
Mm.
versus a place of, I'm a program officer at this large foundation, I'm an expert. um, I look to the partners as being the experts,
Mm.
especially in community. um, I see my role as truly just being of service and of support, of helping to promote the good work that organizations and our partners are doing on the ground. Um, in many ways, as I see it as me being a conduit in philanthropy, and also just ensuring that, especially those partners that are in communities of color and led by leaders from those communities, is that they can see themselves um, in the work that we do. They see themselves reflected. They see their ways of being reflected, or they see their faces reflected in what we do.
Yeah.
For me, that's also really important.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's something that I think a lot of us want to do that are in lower levels in organizations and like want to push for. And I do think it's amazing that you get to live by
Mm,
that.
yeah.
And it's very much connected to my next question because I've gotten a variety of answers on this one, but do you think you can be yourself in philanthropy? Because as we've talked about, and as you mentioned, like it is largely still a white-based culture. So I'd be curious to hear what you think about that.
I I think I grapple with that on a daily basis. Um, and I can only imagine what you feel. Um, I feel safe and just showing up as myself on the team in which I work.
Mm,
Um, and then there are other spaces in the sector where I don't. Um, I think much of that is related to me having to change the way that I live and breathe as a Native person,
mm,
um, culturally, and then coming into a space that's very Western based, um, with the way that it functions and the way that it shows up. So there's always a tension that exists
yeah.
between me having to change the way that I am, to be viewed as a successful person,
Yeah.
um, in a Western worldview. Um, Whereas when I go home and I'm amongst my family and my people, um, success is a very different thing. Um, so yeah, I think in many ways it is a real tension that exists where there's some spaces where I feel safe in showing up, and there are other places that I don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had to sort of create a whole, for lack of a better word, a character to be able to operate in philanthropy to some extent.
Yes,
Yeah.
that is a very true statement.
Yeah. And, I think I didn't have that orientation when my first 8 months. And then I kind of created this character, and it's really helped me the last 5 or 6 months and helped,
Mm,
certain people in the organization to see me better or think I'm more successful, better performance reviews, like all these things that are very real.
mm,
I, even though I'm operating better in the culture, it doesn't necessarily bring me any satisfaction by any stretch.
mm.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just sad that was my process to succeed, if that makes any sense.
It makes total sense because I think that every single one of us, um, feel that and go through it. And I like the way that you describe it as almost like being a character because
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like in so many ways, um, it's how we show up in this society.
Yeah.
Um, and sometimes it can be exhausting because you just want to be yourself and you just want to be able to be human. And there are just places where that is just isn't always the case. Um, and I do worry for folks like us that go through that because it's, how are we able to take care of ourselves?
Yeah.
Um, where do we establish those networks to support one another so that we aren't in isolation, where you can just be like and just totally be 100% who you are, you know? Um, and I hope that the times that we've been able to be out together, like you feel like you are able to like just totally be you, and you're able to just let go of that character, um, and leave it in the office. Um, but it is a real thing, and I just think it's in many ways it's a reaction to the system and the places in which we're at.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Um, yeah, I've gotten better at leaving it in the office. I've got a lot better at it.
I know it's not always so easy.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's very interesting. What am I, obviously, since I'm part of this mentorship program, I adapted some of my questions to philanthropy and everything. But what am I missing? Or what do you think, What do you think philanthropy's role should be going forward? I mean, you talked a lot about service orientation, which I think is like more of a common or new concept that's starting to become more common. Um, I guess I'm just, because I'm newer to the space, I'm trying to think like, how does philanthropy, if at all, play any role in creating radical empathy or like belonging or bridging between cultures? I don't know. I mean, we all want to fund, a lot of people want to fund organizing. I think that's super important. I think there's been a huge stream of money now flowing to what people call anti-hate work.
Yeah.
So, the election in response to hate crimes and a variety of terrible things that have happened. I think immigration's become a huge focus. People are trying to address the problems, but I sometimes feel like we're missing something really huge. And like people keep talking about narrative change work. How do we fight these narratives, create better ones, create a society where everyone feels like they belong? And I don't know, maybe that isn't our role at all as philanthropy. Maybe it really isn't. It's up to people on the ground to do it. And culture shift will happen that way. But I guess, are we supporting that? Like, how do we support that? I don't know if we are actually. Like, anyway, these are questions.
It's almost like, it's like we're supporting it through grants. And at the same time, I think philanthropy can influence a lot and can help change or help to work towards and create change. And I don't know if we are as organized as we could be. Like I see it here in snippets. But like in terms of like a kind of like a national scale, I think there's work to be done in that space. You kind of see, more foundations kind of diving into the racial equity space or the racial justice work. I mean, it's there. But what else can be done on a larger scale for that to be able to happen? And also just being able to speak out more. I know it's always a challenge in philanthropy, right? Especially for private foundations and, speaking out on various issues or talking about various topics related to racial equity. But I, often wonder the same question as you. What are we missing? Especially on that larger scale, what needs to move, and how do we motivate and get it started?
Yeah, because I feel like every conference I've been going to recently, we keep hearing this, like we need the new progressive agenda, or we need the big progressive tent, or we need some overarching narrative or frame that unites us all. Because I've gone to I've gone to conferences on voting rights, on immigration, on like civic engagement, and like these are all like pieces, but no one has the like, I don't know, big organizer. It's interesting.
It's kind of like, how the UN does their development goals and all these things, and it's like, well, where's philanthropy's goals and racial equity, like the joint goals? How do we do that? How do we make that happen? Or what are the joint goals in terms of immigration or civic engagement? All those areas. What unites and pulls people together?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think we're there yet.
No, I don't think so either.
I feel like, so I didn't get to go to Policy Link because I was at another conference. Did you get a chance to go?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I've just been so deeply immersed in a lot of the work here that I haven't been able to step away as much as I was before.
Yeah, I was just curious because I think some people are thinking they might be the organizer of the progressive tent potentially. I've heard a couple different conveners or names or organizations. Do you know what I mean? And I still don't know. I think it's just something I want to work on a little bit to think about with a few other people in my organization.
Mm, I think you should. Yes, very supportive of you.
Well, I am conscious that it is 4 o'clock. I didn't know if you had another call you needed to jump on.
No, I am just wrapping up. I try to leave some time open on Friday afternoons just to catch up on everything. And so your call for this afternoon was perfect timing.
I mean, if you have any other thoughts on any of the things I raised, or, always feel free to send me more thoughts afterwards. And yeah, I'm excited. I haven't quite decided how I'm going to write about everything yet, but I think it'll be a good challenge.
I'm excited for you. I'm sure it's going to be fantastic.
Well, I want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think it'll be, I think it's going to be really interesting. And I don't quite know what I'm going to do yet after Kresge. I think I mentioned that already. I have about 10 months left in my role. And so it's really early, but I am still trying to think like what is the next thing. So
do you think you want to stay in philanthropy?
I feel like, I've talked to some more people now in philanthropy, and a lot of people are advising me to go do something else and then come back.
Mm.
Like go work in the field or go, study something else that you're really interested in and then come back. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it really depends on have you been able to work in the field extensively?
I really haven't. I was in
Okay.
business before this. Yeah. So
Okay. You might want to think about that. And being able to get a little bit more immersed in the field. Because then you'll be able to get the breadth of the experience of the programming and everything that goes on and what needs to be done, and then also just getting immersed in an organization. And there's work that you can do in the policy advocacy space if it's something that you're interested in. So, I mean, I worked in the field for any number of years, and that's where I learned some of the greatest life lessons. So that maybe there is value in that. Absolutely, if you want to go down that road, because you can most certainly always come back to philanthropy. And I feel like it's such a place of privilege. So being in the field brings on all these new experiences that I think that you might find for yourself to be very valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. It's true. It is a very privileged. It's just a totally different way of looking at the world, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I'm considering doing something else and then coming back to philanthropy. I think that's where I'm at.
I think that might be wise.
Well, I will let you go, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. You're most welcome. I'm glad we had a chance to touch base. And I see, is the graduation in early June, like June 1st or something?
Yeah, June 1st. Yep.
Awesome. Looking forward to that. And hopefully we have a chance to see each other before then, if we can find some time.
Yeah, hopefully. Yes. We'll have to see if we can arrange some time in May.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
All right.
All right. All right. See you. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye.
All right. Bye.